What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a Porsche 970 Panamera GTS. Today on the Panamera behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your front brakes. In front of me we have a Zimmermann TechStar kit, which is available on fcpeuro.com. We also have a couple different options available as well. If you select your vehicle, you'll see different types of pad materials and different brands for the brake disc rotors. But today, this is a kit we're going to be going with, which also includes the brake pad wear sensors, as well as some anti-rattle clips and some set screws. Additionally, we have added some caliper screws here. Porsche recommends you replace these every time you do the brakes. While they're not torque to yield bolts, it definitely does not hurt in following that procedure. If you're going to reuse yours, just be sure you clean them up nicely before reinstalling. Now, these brakes are going to last you typically anywhere from 20 to 60,000 miles. The pads are pretty thin to begin with from the factory when new. And seeing how these are such heavy cars, it's going to need a lot of stopping power to slow it down, especially with the 6-pot calipers up front. So they're not going to last you as long as, let's just say, a smaller vehicle. Some things you can look for as you are getting ready to do your brake job is do a visual inspection of everything, see how everything looks. You can see how much pad you have left if you have a feeler gauge tool, which is available on the site as well. That will let you measure the thickness of the pads on your vehicle. Anything less than 2 millimeters, you want to go ahead and replace the pads. Another thing you can do is inspect the rotors. If you have a lip developing on either the inboard or outboard edge of the disc, then more than likely the pad has worn through the rotor and it's time to replace them. Another thing you can do is if you feel any pulsation while you're doing some heavy braking, usually that means warped rotors, but keep in mind that that can sometimes also mean you have some worn out suspension components. So it's good to do a visual inspection. We'll do one once we head over to the Panamera. But before we get started on that, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. For this job, we'll be using a hammer. We have a piston compressing tool, which will be linked in the description below. We have a small flathead screwdriver. The old set screws on this vehicle are Phillips head, so we have a large Phillips head screwdriver. However, the new set screws are going to be installed using a T27. For that, we'll be using that with a small 1/4-inch ratchet. We also have a 1/2-inch drive ratchet, as well as a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench, a 19mm socket for our lug bolts, a T60 for our caliper bolts, and then some nice to haves are always electric tools, especially a drill with a wire wheel to clean up our hubs. And then some chemicals we recommend is some penetrating fluid. We have some brake clean and some liquid moly ceramic paste. Now we know what tools we're working with. Let's go ahead and get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, before we get started on the brake job, it is important to know, and this applies to any vehicle you're going to be working on, where your brake master cylinder reservoir is located and what the fluid level looks like. If before you start your job, the fluid level already looks a little too high, you're going to want to consider removing some fluid from the reservoir so that when you compress the pistons back into your calipers, it doesn't overflow and overpressurize up here and possibly cause a leak. It never hurts either to remove the cap and just inspect the condition of the fluid. If it looks a little dark, then more than likely it's time to change it. A good interval just for safe insurance is at least every 2 years. That way your fluid stays nice and fresh, no moisture builds up in there and starts corroding your system. Our fluid level looks okay, so we'll just keep an eye on it as we go through this brake job, but now we know where that's located. Let's go ahead and get the car up in the air and start on this brake DIY. All right, to put the Panamera in jack mode so you don't damage any of the air suspension components, you're going to turn your ignition on. You're going to press and hold down the suspension button for at least 10 seconds. And on our display screen, we will see something that says the system is off. And that way we can safely lift the vehicle without hurting anything on the car. So hold the button down. Keep an eye on the screen. Level control off. And now we can safely jack up the vehicle. All right, my good people, today we're going to be working on the front passenger side of the Panamera. However, the steps are going to be identical for both sides, as both of them have wear sensors and all that good stuff. To get started, we have 5 19mm lug bolts to remove. If your vehicle has a wheel lock, make sure you have that handy before you start this job. I can tell you how many times I've been stuck before even starting because I couldn't find this little guy. So if you have that, make sure you have it handy. Go ahead and zap these 5 lugs off. Now with our wheel off, we have a better view of where we're going to be working. We have our massive brake calipers, our massive brake discs, set screws, all that good stuff. It's important to note the orientation of the slots on the rotor, but more importantly, the slots of the cooling fins and which direction they're going. There is a left and right disc included in this kit, 2 different part numbers. So you just want to make sure you're installing the right disc on the right side. So with that, before we continue any further, I always like to take this time to clean up the brake caliper a bit before I continue on this job. That way, when I assemble everything together, everything is nice, new and clean. So I'm gonna go ahead and take 2 seconds, clean this up. Well, more like 10 minutes for me, 2 seconds for you. And then we'll pick it back up at removal of our brake caliper. All right, my good people, you can see I cleaned up the caliper just a bit. It's not perfect, but it'll definitely give us a better working environment whenever we put everything back together. Before we start working on removing our big T60s that hold this caliper in place, we're going to work on disconnecting our brake pad wear sensor and releasing our soft line from the whole assembly here so that we can have some play to hang our caliper. Now, since we have the car up in the air, I simply went ahead and rotated the wheels over to our side so that we have a better view of everything. But if you're working at home, just hop in, turn the steering wheel if you want a better angle at these big bolts. So first, we're going to remove the brake pad wear sensor. So let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to unplug it from the harness side of the car, or off of the harness side of the car, so that the sensor will come off with the brake pads. These tabs are always annoying. Sometimes it helps to push them closed, and then you can undo them. Then that cable is simply routed through the small plastic clip by the soft line connection to the brake caliper. To release that, you can just pop the clip with a small flathead screwdriver or pick, just gently, just like that. Now that we have it open, we can pull the line out. And at this point, if you want to, you can simply yank it out of the brake pad. We're going to be replacing these. If you're not going to be replacing them, you might want to pull them out a little bit more carefully, but they're fairly inexpensive and sometimes they can be finicky. So if you can, I recommend it. Otherwise, you can just pull it out and set it to the side or throw it out. With that undone, the next thing is going to be to free up the soft line. So there is a metal clip on the other side, on the rear side of the wheel well, that we're going to release so that this soft line has some play and we can move the caliper kind of wherever we want. So let's do that next. I'm going to use a small flathead screwdriver to pry it off. Should go down towards the axle. All right, and with that removed, now you have some play in the line. Just pull it through, and now that'll be free to move around the caliper. All right, now at this point, we're going to start by removing the 2 T60s that hold our brake caliper in place. I'm using a 1/2-inch drive ratchet to help break these big bolts free. Before I pull that all the way out, I'm just going to get a caliper hook ready to hang this massive caliper, hopefully off of this upper control arm here. We might have to do 2 hooks or change everything a bit once we get to that point, but at least want to have something ready to go. Zip ties will also work great, again, if you don't have hooks or bungee cords. These are pretty heavy though, so make sure you have something substantial. If you're working on the ground, you might even be able to use a floor jack or maybe like a small bucket and just sit these on there. There we go. I have 2 hooks that I'm using to hold the caliper in place, and I just shoved one of the ends of the hook through where the bolt hole goes on the back side. As long as you don't move it around too much, you should be fine. If you're worried about marring up the paint, use a little bit of painter's tape around that area. You'll be okay. With the brake caliper off, we can look at the rotor a little more carefully, if you will, and it may be hard to see at home, but these have quite the aggressive lip on both the inside and the outside edges of the disc, and you can hear that screwdriver stopping there. Obviously, don't do this if you're reusing your rotors. We're not, but if your rotors look like this, definitely go ahead and replace them. So before I work on removing those Phillip head screws off, I'm going to thread a lug bolt back in just in case the rotor decides to fall off on us and crush our toesy. So let's not do that. Just a couple threads is fine. Now we're going to take our Phillips head screwdriver in this case and work on removing both of these set screws. I like to get my screwdriver into place or socket, whatever the hardware may be, and give it a couple taps with a hammer just to break any corrosion that may be holding them together. Use a screwdriver here to counter hold this from turning. Just going to use a little bit of penetrating fluid to help this one out. It's clearly a bit seized in there. Also bump it up to a larger screwdriver. Another tip for those of you that are struggling at home like me, if your caliper is still on, go ahead and shove the screwdriver in and use the screwdriver against the caliper as a stop to keep the whole assembly from moving. Definitely could have done that in the first place, but you know, hindsight's 30/80 or whatever they say. All right, our rotor is most certainly seized to that hub. That's why we thread the lug bolt back in. Now we can give it a couple whacks with the hammer, or one, and we can work it off. Now we have our brake disc off. This is a good time to clean up our hub, scrape off any corrosion that may be on here so that when we put our new rotor on, hopefully they don't seize together. You can use a wire wheel, emery cloth, a wire brush, whatever you have, just to kind of clean up everything. I'm going to use a wire wheel on a drill attachment, and we'll just zap that clean, maybe give the backing plate a little bit of a wipe down, and go from there. All right, while not perfect, it is certainly better. Before we go ahead and put some liquid moly ceramic paste on there or your NECs of choice, we're going to go ahead and work on prepping our caliper for new pads and, if needed, new clips as well. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, now we're going to work on compressing the pistons back in. As I mentioned, we're using this dual spreader tool to press both of the pistons in, or all 6 pistons, 3 on each side at the same time. We're going to be using the old brake pads as our backing plate. That way, that's the reason we left them in there from the beginning. So we'll get our tool into place, kind of keep it centered as best as possible. Just squeeze the trigger, make sure these are both going in evenly. And then you'll feel the tool bottom out. You'll be able to visually see that the pistons have fully seated themselves back into the caliper. Not a whole lot of travel here. Again, these are really big brake discs along with a big caliper, so the pads are going to be kind of thin. The travel is going to be minimal as well. With those compressed, now we can remove this tool. And now we can work on removing the brake pads. We're going to go ahead and just slide them out, and we'll slide out the next one. These are identical, both inboard and outboard. They both have a spot for the brake pad wire sensor, so there's no real mixing them up here. And here is our old outboard pad. Now we have the brake pads removed. We're going to go ahead and do some cleanup in here, clean up the face of the pistons. We'll clean up the dowels that the pads sit on, and then we'll pick it up with installing our fresh new pads. All right, with the area cleaned up a bit, now we're going to work on replacing the anti-rattle clips, if you will, that sit in the caliper. These don't typically go bad. Ours are in pretty good shape as the pads were not too old on this car, but the rotors were old, so they just didn't mesh properly and wear evenly. So you could just leave them, clean them up, and reuse them on the caliper like we just did. But to show you how to replace them, pretty straightforward. We'll grab a small flathead screwdriver and just pry them out. I'm prying on the inside of the caliper. I'm not too worried about damaging the paint in here. Just getting my flathead through the clip. Just to show a better view of what we did, we just stuck the screwdriver through the body of the clip and pried it towards us. They only go one way. Obviously the notched parts go up and down, and then these looped ends go left and right. So we'll go ahead and get rid of that. And then we can take our new clip. Sometimes this can be a pain in the butt, but they're just pressed fit in there. We'll go ahead and kind of get it into place. So that is our clip replaced. We're going to go ahead and replace the bottom one as well. Same way. Through the end. Pry it up towards us. And now we'll set our clip in for the bottom one. I'm going to get started on the bottom first. And bam, baby, we have new anti-rattle clips installed. At this point, I'm going to take just a small dab of ceramic paste and coat the face of each of the pistons. And we're going to coat the dowels on the caliper as well. And then we'll feed our new pads in. And I want to make sure the surfaces are clean, dry, free of any debris or chemical you may have used to clean these calipers up. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of ceramic paste and just dab it on the tip of my finger. And with that all situated, now we can feed in our new pads. These pads are the Techstar ones. They do have a small metal shim on the back of them. Just make sure that shim is lined up so that the dowel holes on the shim line up with the dowel holes on the pad. They can dance around a little bit. They only go in one way. Obviously follow the curvature of the caliper. Feed them in at the top. And then you're kind of pushing the pads up against the clips when you do the initial placement of them, and then you're going to slide them over the dowels. So again, I'm going to slide them kind of into place, push down on the pad, and then slide them over the dowels. Now our caliper is fully loaded, ready to go. So we can apply a little bit of our preferred anti-seize compound or ceramic compound on the hub for our new rotor. While Zimmerman doesn't call for you to use anything, this is a New England car. It is going to see snow and salt, so it's still going to rust. That coating will eventually wear off over time, so this will just help kind of keep these two surfaces from mating together in the long run. So a little bit of ceramic paste definitely will not hurt. All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and make sure we have some clean hands to work with. The new rotors are zinc coated, so the last thing you want to do is get your greasy paws all over them, because you don't want to hit them with any brake clean. Otherwise, you'll deteriorate this zinc coating on them quicker than it needs to be. So I'll clean up my gloves. We'll grab our correct rotor for this side and get ready to install it. All right, we got some freshies on. We're going to grab our new rotor, set it over our hub, lining up the set screw holes as best as possible. Now what I'm going to do is a little bit overkill. I'm going to put a little bit of ceramic paste in the seat of where the set screw goes, just so that the next person that does these brakes has an easier time than I did getting those set screws out. The new ones do have a little bit of Loctite from the factory, so if you're using your set screws, make sure you apply a little bit of Loctite on there. The new set screws that come with the brake kit are a T27 versus the Phillips head that we removed earlier. For those of you following along at home, the torque spec for these is about 10 Newton meters. We're just going to use the old calibrated wrist today to snug them up. But if you have a torque wrench, no more than 10 Newton meters for these small set screws. I like to encapsulate them, again, giving them a fighting chance at not seizing with the rotor. Now we have that situated, I'm just going to spin back our assembly this way. I'm going to grab my new caliper screws for the caliper, and we'll get ready to swing the caliper over and mate it back to the whole assembly here. So let's do that next. All right, now we're going to go ahead and unhook our caliper and swing it over our brake disc. Don't forget to take your hooks or bungee cords off. Last thing you want to do is go for a test drive and hear some clanging around in your wheel wells. All right, there's one. Let's get the second one started. Beautiful. Once you have them both started by hand, you can grab your T60 once more and snug them down, and then we'll give them a final torque. All right, we're going to snug up our T60s, and then we're going to torque them down to 140 Newton meters. Once they're both snug up by hand, we'll set our torque wrench to 140 Newton meters. There's the bottom one, beautiful. Now we're going to reinstall the securing clip that holds our soft line in place. To do that, we're going to take our line, feed it from the front side of the car, if you will, through the bracket. Just like that. There is a small groove on the soft line that lets this clip. These can also be a pain in the butt to install, just like they're a pain in the butt to remove. There we go. I just used the flathead to help pry it up. And now that's nice and secured. Now we're going to go ahead and install our brake pad wear sensor. It's important to note they only go in one way. If you look at the sensor, it's got a meteor side on one side and a thin side on the other. The meteor side is going to go towards the brake disc. The thin side will go towards the caliper, or the outside of the caliper. There's a small cutout on the pad that this sensor will live in. Simply press it into place and key it in like that. And you can route the sensor wire through the body of the caliper. Now we can swing the wire over, plug it back into the car. There's that nice click. And then there was one more clip here by the soft line that helps hold everything together. All right, and now with that, we have fully replaced the brakes on the Panamera. Now we have everything nice and cleaned up and secured and torqued down properly. The last thing left to do is install our wheel, so let's do that now. Nice, we got the bolt holes lined up first try. Let's get a lug started in here. Always start your lugs by hand whenever possible. The last thing you want to do is strip out your hub and not be able to go for a good test drive. Now we're just going to gently snug up the wheel to the face of the hub here so that we know once it's on the ground, it'll tighten down evenly. Always do this in a star pattern whenever possible. All right. For the final torque on these 19mm lug bolts, we're going to torque them down to 180 Newton meters. We have our torque wrench set up. We're going to tighten them down in a star pattern. And with that, my good people, you have just completed the brakes on your Panamera. Hopefully you found this DIY helpful. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, or there's a specific job you want to see be done on the 970 chassis, leave it down in the comment section below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.